Years ago, I walked a handful of blocks up the street from my partner's house to a convenience store to buy something to drink. It was around 11 p.m., and I was trying to make it to the store before it closed. The neighborhood we lived in was transitional, with abandoned houses and prevalent crime, along with a few occupied residences and businesses scattered about. There were no streetlights, leaving the streets completely dark. It resembled a condensed version of the type of Detroit neighborhood depicted in the movie Barbarian. In retrospect, going to the store at night was incredibly foolish, but after living in that environment for years, I had become somewhat desensitized to the risks. On this particular night, I embarked on yet another reckless trip to the store. My partner had repeatedly asked me not to do it, but I ignored their advice because I simply wanted a drink. A few blocks up the street, navigating through the usual darkness, I successfully bought my drink. As I exited the store, I noticed a guy standing near the trash can, hassling everyone who came out, asking for money, cigarettes, and the like. I informed him that I had nothing and proceeded to cross the parking lot to head back. However, this guy suddenly lunged towards me like a rabbit and grabbed my arm. He aggressively demanded that I go to a party with him, attempting to steer me down the pitch-black side street beside the convenience store. He was incredibly tall, probably around 6'7", and extremely thin, with dreads obscuring his face, making it difficult to see his features. His fingers dug into my arm, feeling as though they had pinched a nerve. Instantly, my heart began pounding crazily. Despite being accustomed to brushing off such behavior due to my years of living in that neighborhood, this encounter was far more aggressive than anything I had previously experienced. I managed to shake my arm free from his grasp and told him I was heading to my boyfriend's place, which was only a few blocks down the street. I mentioned that he was waiting for me, apologized in an attempt to placate the guy, and quickly started speed-walking down the street. He called after me multiple times, and then I heard his hurried footsteps as he decided to follow me. At that moment, my heartbeat felt as though it had migrated to my eyeballs. My mouth went completely dry, and I was almost hyperventilating from fear. I tried to stay quiet, fearing that the guy would hear me. I had an inexplicable sense that showing fear or looking back at him would provoke an immediate, violent reaction. I increased my pace, attempting to outwalk him. However, my 5'5" legs were no match for his long stride, and I could hear the sound of rock and concrete crunching under his feet as he closed in on me. My heart felt like it would burst out of my chest or explode from fear. I tried walking even faster, but the guy was right behind me. I could hear his breath in my ear, and I had an overwhelming sense that he would grab me at any second, perhaps even with a weapon, and force me to go wherever he desired. The neighborhood was completely dark, devoid of any real traffic at night. If he wanted to coerce me into going with him, I would be powerless, except for attempting to run. But with his height advantage, I knew he would catch up to me quickly. Finally, I caught sight of my boyfriend's driveway, with him standing at the end, waiting for me. He had a terrible feeling and was constantly worried about me walking at night, so he came outside to wait for me. I noticed that he had his crowbar in one hand, his usual defense weapon kept near the front door. At that moment, my nerves broke, and I sprinted towards him. To my horror, the tall man behind me started running after me. I reached my boyfriend, and in a trembling voice, I managed to utter help or something similar. I dove behind him, cowering and awaiting the tall man to pull out a gun and shoot us both or engage in a struggle with my boyfriend. But it didn't happen. The tall man approached my boyfriend, standing way too close, and asked for a light. My boyfriend obliged, holding the crowbar aloft in his other hand to ensure it was visible. I grabbed hold of my boyfriend, pulled him into the house, and locked the door. I completely lost control, sobbing and panicking while attempting to explain what had just happened. My boyfriend looked out from the windows and saw the tall man lingering for a while before eventually leaving. We would occasionally spot him in the following months, either at the store or walking up and down the street. Unsurprisingly, I never took another nighttime walk after that incident. Even now, I still occasionally have nightmares about it. Several years ago, I was in the midst of an acrimonious divorce from my then husband, full of crazy allegations and typical angry filings centered around custody of our child. As with many divorces, friends and professional colleagues seem to pick one side or the other. In my case, there was one sort of professional contact who reached out to me after hearing about the divorce and offered to be a witness for my case because of some experiences he related that I had been previously unaware of regarding my ex behavior at networking events. After this initial call, he started calling on a semi-regular basis to make sure I was okay. This wasn't someone I knew well before the separation, and he was much older than I was, but claimed to have experience with divorce and custody. I figured it was a good idea to be polite and not alienate him, since his testimony was important per my lawyer. I kept things friendly, but I always had a weird feeling about him. After a few months, he called one day when my son was very sick. When I told him I couldn't talk and explained why, he offered to run to the store for me, which I honestly appreciated. But after that, he started dropping by the house uninvited or would stop by with cookies for my son, etc. Again, I kept telling myself to keep things polite. The divorce is coming soon. Don't make this guy mad. He had called me out of the blue, and I was worried at this point that I was walking a very fine line being polite but not interested, and that if he got mad, he might decide to go testify for my ex and say who knows what. During this time, he had also helped me set up a security cam system my dad had mailed me, and at one point, I needed someone to walk my dog, and he had offered to do it. He used and returned a spare key the same day. One evening, he showed up while I was painting and insisted on sticking around to help, even though I was having my starting over catharsis and wanted to do it alone. Just after the painting day, he came around uninvited and unannounced with magazine photos of the decor and started carrying on in this manic way about how we could finish decorating the house. I was so weirded out that I made an excuse to leave, started ignoring his calls, and took my son and dog to stay with my parents for several weeks to avoid a drop-in. I came home just for custody exchanges a few weeks later, thinking he would have gotten the hint, and it was a quiet day. The following morning, I took my son on an outing, something like the zoo, and we both came back hot and tired. I put my kiddo down for a nap in my bed and decided to close my eyes with him. I woke up maybe an hour or so later, and it took me a moment to realize something was way off. As I blinked off the sleep, I realized there was a rose bush sitting on my bedside table that I most definitely had not put there. There was a post-it note on it, something about planting it in the yard. I started shaking immediately because I recognized the handwriting and stood up to splash some water on my face and decide whether to call my parents or the police. I didn't want any trouble because of the divorce. As I stepped into my bathroom, I realized that the mirror was covered in post-it notes, all with super creepy messages that were intended as love notes, or with affection, but which all scared me. I was still waking up and trying to figure out how these notes could have gotten into my house. My front door was locked, but as I went from room to room, there were notes everywhere. I mean, hundreds of post-it notes covering the walls. In my cabinets, there was even one inside my coffee maker. I started grabbing all of them and putting them into a pile. When I got to one in the kitchen that made my blood run cold, it said, "You're cute when you think no one is watching you." And I realized that there was a security camera pointed right where that note was left, the one he had helped me set up months earlier when I didn't think he was a psychopath. I called my parents in hysterics, sent them a bunch of photos, and my dad insisted I should not call the police, remember, custody battle, but that he would drive over and change the locks and put a chain on the door. We also immediately changed the passwords on the security cameras, which had been installed to document if my ex tried to break into the house. So there was one on the front porch, but 3 inside the house, including one in my bedroom. This man could see and hear everything going on inside my house for months. I realized he had paid attention to my passwords when I was setting up the system, but the only way I can figure out that he got into my house is that he must have made a copy of my house key the day he had it, and because my dog had gotten to know him, he wouldn't have barked to warn me, which also scared me. I was horrified. This man had been in my house for a long time. There's no way he could have put that many notes up quickly, and he was right next to my face and feet from my son while we were sleeping, and somehow thought that was okay. I left and stayed with my parents again for a few days, afraid of what he was going to do when he realized that he was now both physically and digitally locked out of my house. When I came home, my son had gone to his dad's for the night, and I was home alone on the phone with another friend from out of town at about 10 p.m. This man showed up at the door, pounding on it, trying the locks, screaming obscenities, and demanding to be led into his house. Gone were all the niceties. This was someone completely furious and derailed. All I could do was hide in my bedroom until he left, what felt like an hour later. This was St. Patrick's Day, so I'm sure he had been drinking. After that, there were several other times someone would start knocking on the door in the middle of the night, always when my son wasn't home. I think he was crazy, but not that crazy, and figured if I called the police, he would get in more trouble if my son was there. But he knew the schedule, so I knew it was him. He tried reaching out using fake social media accounts several times, always getting blocked. Years later, I discovered that he had friended my mom on Facebook and was, therefore, still able to see all the photos of us that she posted or shared. There was a huge argument when I saw a conversation they were having about me and how he could get back into my life. I sold that house 2 years later, still finding new notes even as I was packing, and I am more than relieved that he no longer knows where I live. I don't post photos of my new house online, not the front anyway, and I have changed the privacy settings on my social media accounts. I avoid all the places he used to go and the networking events he attends, and I stay as under the radar as possible. I could never bring myself to play back the security camera videos because I was traumatized enough and didn't want to see just how much danger we could have been in. Hopefully, he never sees this post, but you know who you are. I hope our paths don't cross again. This was back in 2013 when I was living in NYC as a 23-year-old. I was living with my best friend from college on the west side near Times Square and K-Town. I was going through some tough times back then, as I was unemployed at that time. I had a lot of time, so I would go on walks by myself to clear my head from time to time. One night, I was feeling especially depressed, so I decided to walk to K-Town to grab a drink by myself. I'm Korean, by the way. I walked into a Korean bar and got some weird looks from the waiter as I asked for a table by myself. After ordering a couple of soju bottles, I was feeling pretty drunk, so I decided to walk back home. However, as I was exiting the bar, this Korean guy followed me. He looked very normal, just like a nice Korean guy. He told me that he saw me drinking at the bar by myself and that he would love to walk me home to make sure I got home safely. I politely declined. After all, my apartment was pretty close, but he insisted, and he looked so harmless that I decided to take him up on his offer. We walked for like 10 minutes, I think, and it was quite pleasant. We were both a little drunk, but I remember talking about all sorts of things. When we finally arrived at my apartment, I thanked him and wished him farewell. Now, my apartment was a 5-story walk-up, and there was a main door where we needed a key to open to get into the building. I didn't think much of it, and inserted the key to open the door and went in. The door took a while to close, and it was my mistake for not checking before I went up the stairs. While I was approaching the 2nd floor, I heard someone grab the door from closing, and I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. I got goosebumps all over my body, and I felt like I was in danger. As I started to pick up the pace, I heard the footsteps going faster up the stairs. I lived on the 5th floor, and I started to run up, clutching my keys in my hand. The guy started to run up the stairs as well, and I could hear him getting closer and closer to me. This all happened in a couple of seconds, but it felt so long. I finally got to my floor, and as I tried to open the door, I looked back and saw the guy's head on the staircase. I rushed to open the door and managed to close the door right on his face. My heart was beating so fast, and I didn't know what to do at that point. It was already 3 a.m., and my roommate was asleep. Luckily, he didn't knock or anything, so I decided to just go to my room and hope that he'd gone home. Around 7 a.m., my roommate woke me up. She said that a man was standing in front of our apartment door. My heart sank, and I explained the whole situation to her. She and I went to the door and screamed that we were going to call the police if he didn't go home. I looked at the peephole, and he told me that he would only go home if I gave him my number. We then called the police and saw him being escorted out. My roommate had to go to work, so she left the apartment and called me a few minutes later. She told me that she saw the guy speaking to the police downstairs. He tried to lie to the officers that I was his girlfriend and that we got into a fight. My roommate went up to them and explained to the officers that I did not have a boyfriend and that she didn't know him at all. The police let him off with a warning. About 2 hours later, I heard a buzz from the main door downstairs. Maybe it's the police. Surely it can't be him again. I answered the intercom, and I was shook. It was him again. "Just give me your number, and I'll go away," he said. I warned him that I was going to call the police again if he didn't leave. A couple of minutes later, I heard ferocious knocks on my door. He must have gotten in when someone was entering the building. I was so scared at that point, so I immediately called the police. Unfortunately, the guy ran away before the police got there. The worst part about this experience was that my roommate and I were so scared to leave and come back to our apartment. I would have anxiety every time I came home, worried that I might see him in front of our apartment door. For about a week, the police escorted us when we felt scared. I never saw him again, but it was one of the scariest moments of my life.